Thanks for your time. Talking to Dr. Gerald Horne. I wanted to talk to you about what I call Russia phobia. This has been on my mind a long time, especially since the 2008 election when Hillary Clinton was really blasting Putin and Russia. And I felt that there was going to be a war, a third world war. But you have a whole historical analysis. Would you share that with our audience, please?
Well, the immediate response is that it's an outgrowth of the Russian Revolution, October 1917. It was thought by many to have ignited a general crisis of the entire capitalist system, including the United States of America. But more to the point, what Moscow began to do after the Soviet Union came into being was supporting national liberation movements, not least in Africa, which helped to erode the advantage that the North Atlantic countries had in terms of exploiting the labor and natural resources of Africa and the Caribbean in particular. I'm thinking of the gold of South Africa, the bauxite of Jamaica, for example. And this particular episode in history is dramatically represented in a documentary that you can find streaming. Perhaps you might even be able to see it in the theater in the Los Angeles area. I'm thinking of Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat, which deals with the overthrow and murder of Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba. And the movie is punctuated with many scenes from the United Nations where then Soviet leaders are berating and denouncing the European colonizers and their backers in Washington for their seeking to undermine Congolese independence. Now, that's the short answer to the roots of Russophobia, but it actually extends before October 1917. For example, during the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865, we see that the Russian fleet sailed into ports on the Atlantic and the Pacific in support of the Lincoln government and undermining the secessionist efforts of the so-called Confederate States of America, the 11 states stretching from Virginia to Texas, which sought to secede from the United States in order to perpetuate enslavement of Africans forevermore. This muscular support for the Lincoln government was quite helpful to the men in blue who were fighting the men in gray. It did not endear Russia to the enslavers who wound up losing that war. And then, of course, we can talk about another striking episode in African history. I'm speaking of the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, then now known as Ethiopia in the 1890s, where Italy was seeking to emulate Britain and France in terms of grabbing a then independent African nation. But alas, it was defeated, not least because Russia had rushed to the defense of the Abyssinian government, arming it to the teeth. Because if you look at the geography of Europe, you'll quickly note that Russia is the most populous nation on the European continent, 150 million contemporary population today, compared to number two, Germany of 82 million. And yet, Russia was not involved in the scramble for Africa, which enriched and fattened the Western European nations. And Russia had little incentive to back the Western European nations in terms of their exploitation of Africa, not least because the Western European nations had a bone to pick with Russia. I'm thinking of the Crimea War in the 1850s, where Britain and France teamed up with Ottoman Turkey in waging war against Russia and was somewhat successful. Or I'm thinking as well of the War of 1812. You may recall that during that particular war between Britain and the United States, that thousands of Africans de defected to the British side and were transported on boats to be free and independent nationals in Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. And Russia was selected to determine how the enslavers should be compensated for their loss of this major investment. I think that Russia was quite generous to the enslavers. They did not think so. And that also contributed to Russophobia. So, in other words, there are many reasons, oftentimes neglected, I'm afraid to say, in popular discourse for this phenomenon of Russophobia, which is exploding as we speak in light of the fact that Mr. Trump has authorized his allies in Ukraine to use U.S. missiles to shoot rockets deeper into Russian territory, which is doubtlessly infuriating to Moscow.
I'm sorry, you said Mr. Trump is, you said authorizing missiles
Oh,
to
I meant to say,
go.
oh, sorry, I meant to say Mr. Biden authorized the Kiev ally to send rockets deeper into Russian territory as we speak, which is doubtlessly infuriating to Moscow. There are those who are quite sober who suggest that we are closer to a nuclear conflagration today than at any time since October 1962 with the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis. And of course, the latter was quite alarming and threatening. Recall that in the wake of the so-called Bay and Pigs invasion of the United States and Cuban mercenaries of Cuba, a few years after the triumph of the revolution in January 1959, that Russia put defensive missiles in Cuba in order to deter another possible invasion. And alas, Washington, under President Kennedy, saw that as threatening to U.S. national security, which led to an eyeball to eyeball confrontation where this small planet barely escaped a nuclear exchange. The agreement worked out was that U.S. would withdraw missiles from its allies, speaking of Turkey, that were seen as threatening to the then Soviet Union. But alas, that notable detail was not necessarily reported in the US press, which then led to this fallacy that Moscow and Washington were eyeball to eyeball, and Moscow blinked, and that helped to further accelerate hawkish tendencies in Washington. So the sum and substance is that there is a long history that helps to explain the Russophobia of the United States of America, which continues to percolate as we speak.
That's so interesting. Let me ask you this, because that Russophobia is taking the place even when I was a young child. I remember I might have mentioned this on the program, my program, that it was Russia who's always the bad guy, even in cartoons with Rocky and Bullwinkle the squirrel. The villains were Boris and Natasha. So even with all this history that we thank you for laying out, why continuously are they attacking and want to disstable Russia?
Well, the pattern that I outlined is still in place. If you look at the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which met in October 2024 in Kazan, Russia, issuing a Kazan Declaration, which on the one hand says it does not want to replace the US dominated world order, but on the other hand, lays out a blueprint for doing precisely that. You would not be mistaken to see the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus the nations just co-opted, which I will not mention, including Egypt, Ethiopia, Nigeria, United Arab Emirates, Iran, for example, that in some ways the BRICS mimics the European Union, where Germany is the economic locomotive and France is the political commissar. In the BRICS, China is the economic locomotive and Russia is the political commissar. That is to say, it is in many ways directing the politics of this very stiff challenge to US hegemony. And so, as you go around the world, the patterns that I outlined historically are still in place despite the dissolution of the Soviet Union on December 25th, 1991.
Uh, Also, you mentioned, I heard you mention the the extent of the 1991 fall of the USSR and the effect on those I would call third world countries who were vying for their liberation. Could you speak on that, please?
Well, I wrote this book, White Supremacy Confronted, which deals with the struggle for liberation of Southern Africa. And as I point out in that particular book, it's no accident that the apartheid rulers decide to negotiate seriously with the opposition in February 1990 by freeing Nelson Mandela, unbanning the African National Congress and their comrades in the South African Communist Party, which happens a few weeks after the collapse of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, because the apartheid rulers recognized that the Soviet Union and its allies, then allies in Eastern Europe, were arming the African National Congress, were bulwarking the African National Congress, and with the impending dissolution of the socialist bloc, that the ANC would be weakened, would be forced to accept terms that were quite distasteful, which have handicapped an independent South Africa to this very day. So I know that even with some of our friends on the left, there was uncorking of the bottles of champagne when the Soviet Union dissolved. But alas, that was not necessarily mirrored in what we now refer to as the global South.
Wow. And just wrapping up, because I know your time is precious. The what we see now, we have these dog whistles. And the people are using different words like, communism. Then you hear communism is bad. You hear socialism is bad. Even with when Fidel Castro, Fidel, oh my God, dictator. Even with the Muammar Gaddafi, oh my God, bad. Putin, bad, bad. And not even judging what these folks are doing. It seems to be these dog whistles, and Russia has been that and is that now. Could you speak on that a little bit, please?
Well, it also ties in to our analysis of the disastrous electoral results of November 2024 in the United States of America. What I mean is that the Red Scare and the Cold War helped to destabilize successful, or I should say, would be successful left-wing alternatives to neoliberalism, to capitalism, etc., leaving only a Trumpian right-wing alternative. And so, in some ways, we can explain the rise of the Trump faction as a direct result of the Cold War, which posited that there was this conflict between capitalism and socialism. Then, of course, it had domestic implications and consequences in terms of the Red Scare, which led to a routing of progressive trade unions, for example. I'm thinking of the West Coast and the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, for example, led for decades by Harry Bridges of San Francisco. It was ousted from the House of Labor as a direct result of the Red Scare. And I'm afraid to say that you had certain leaders of the NAACP, which made a Faustian bargain that supported the weakening of Harry Bridges Union, despite the fact that, as Danny Glover, amongst others, have suggested, this was the most resolute of anti-racist unions, opening the door for many Black workers to become longshoremen, for example. And so there has been quite a bit of writing and commentary on this, part of which I'm happy to say has been by myself. But alas, what people like myself have written is not necessarily dominant and hegemonic in the political and intellectual discourse as we speak.
So just to wrap up, uh, could I, from what you said, the historical analysis that you've given us, that this whole Russophobia is constructed and basically to keep because of Russia's what would you call it participation in helping those third world and other countries, and continues to this day. Is that basically a good wrap up of what you're saying?
That is a fair analysis and relevant to the crisis in Ukraine, which has thrust this question of Russophobia into today's headlines. We know that strategically, this effort to induce Ukraine, a former comrade of Russia in the Soviet Union, to induce Ukraine to join NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an avowedly anti-Moscow military formation, was bound to be seen in Moscow as crossing an important red line. In fact, William Burns, the current leader of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, had advised as much. And we should also recognize that geostrategically, the purpose of this Ukraine escapade was to weaken Russia so as to better and more effectively confront the People's Republic of China, which is seen as the major economic and military threat to the hegemony and domination of the United States of America. And we should also, once again, revert to history and recognize that as the Western European nations were moving south to exploit Africa, moving across the Atlantic to exploit the indigenous in North America, South America, and the Caribbean, Russia was moving east across the Eurasian continent. Their window on the Pacific, speaking of the major city that is Vladivostok, was only established in 1860. And so you have this fundamental contradiction in European history, whereby the most populous European nation, which is Russia, the most endowed in terms of natural resources, including gold, diamonds, natural gas, oil, and all the rest, which is Russia, was not necessarily seen as the leading power on the continent. That particular title was seen as being held in London, a major beneficiary of colonial exploitation, for example. And so this sets up a fundamental contradiction between the North Atlantic powers and Russia, which is playing out to this very day.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Horn. I don't want to take any more of your time, but I could, and hopefully another time we could talk about Haiti and what's going on in there. But we appreciate you because this has been something I talk about on my program uh, often. And of course, our listeners should know you could hear Dr. Gerald Horne every Saturday at 11 o'clock on KPFK and some other stations. Dr. Horne, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you for inviting me.